November 20th, 1542. I'm standing in the Royal Court of Madrid, holding a document that just changed everything for millions of indigenous people across the Americas. The new laws of 1542 are officially signed, sealed, and about to be delivered. Laws that outlaw Indian slavery and forced labor throughout the Spanish Empire. I'm about to have the biggest formal debate of my life against a guy who thinks I'm completely wrong about everything. My name is Bartolome de las Casas, and this is the AP US History My Story podcast. I came to the Caribbean in 1502 as a young Spanish settler, and I was completely complicit in everything bad that was happening. I had my own encomienda, basically a grant that gave me control over indigenous people and their labor, and I was making bank off their suffering. For about a decade, I was just another Spanish colonist living my best life while the locals died around me from overwork, disease, and straight-up murder. The mortality rates were insane. We're talking about entire populations getting wiped out within a generation. Hispaniola had maybe 250,000 Taino people when Columbus first showed up, and by 1520, there were literally fewer than 500 left. 500. That's not war casualties, that's genocide. The moment everything changed for me was in 1514, when I was preparing a sermon as a priest. Yeah, I became a priest while still owning people, if you can believe that. And I read this passage from Ecclesiasticus. The bread of the needy is their life. He that defrauds them thereof is a murderer. It hit me like a train. I was literally profiting from a system that was murdering people, and I'd been telling myself it was all fine because they weren't Christians or whatever BS justification I was using. I immediately freed everyone under my control and started what would become a 40-year campaign to convince Spain that indigenous people were actual human beings with souls and with rights. And let me tell you, this was not a popular position among Spanish colonists who were getting rich off of their forced labor. The thing that really got people's attention was my book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, which I finished in 1542, the same year as these new laws. I documented every horrific thing I'd witnessed: mass killings, families being torn apart, people being worked to death in mines, children being murdered. It was not subtle. Spanish colonists were feeding indigenous babies to their dogs and burning people alive for entertainment. This is sick and twisted shit they were doing. Now, did I exaggerate some details to make my point? Maybe, but the core truth was absolutely accurate. What Spain was doing to the Americas was systematic extermination disguised as colonization and Christianity. The encomienda system was slavery with extra steps, and everyone knew it. So King Charles I read my book and was literally horrified. That's what led to these new laws that just got signed. They officially ended Indian slavery, restricted the encomienda system, and established that indigenous people had the same rights as any other subjects in the Spanish crown. Well, at least on paper, anyway. But here's where it got interesting from a historical perspective. The laws that I just helped create were about to cause a massive controversy. The Spanish settlers said, we didn't risk everything to come to the New World just to follow the same laws as if we were back in Spain. They revolted in Peru, ignored the laws in Mexico, and sent angry letters to the king saying that I was destroying Spain's colonial project. Some of the laws got repealed within a few years because the economic pressure was too intense. So the whole situation set up the Valladolid debate of 1550 and 1551, where I had to formally argue against Juan Gines de la Sepúlveda about whether indigenous people were actually human. Like we had to have an official scholarly debate about basic human dignity. Sepulveda was arguing that indigenous people were natural slaves, according to Aristotle, and that Spanish conquest was justified because it brought them Christianity and civilization. He said they were barbaric and uncivilized and inferior to Europeans in terms of their cultural and way of life, lacking basic human qualities such as reason and morality. And I was like, bruh, these people had complex societies, systems of government, agriculture, art, and philosophy before we showed up. The Aztecs had cities larger than anything in Europe. The Inca had engineering that we could barely understand. How do you call that naturally inferior? What's really important to understand is how this debate connected to the larger patterns of European Native American interactions that you'll hear about in other episodes. You heard Cortez in 1.5 about conquering Aztecs. Well, I was dealing with the aftermath of those kinds of conquests and trying to create a different model for how Europeans and indigenous people could coexist. My work was part of a broader conversation happening across Europe about what colonization should look like. Were we supposed to be extracting wealth and enslaving people, or were we supposed to be creating genuine Christian communities where everyone was treated fairly? These weren't just academic questions. They determined whether millions of people lived or died. The really frustrating thing is that even though we got these laws passed, enforcement was basically impossible across the thousands of miles of Spanish colonial territory. Local officials could ignore royal commands, colonists could hide their abuse, and indigenous people often had no way to report violations or seek justice. But the legal framework mattered. It established the principle that indigenous people had rights under Spanish law, even if those rights weren't always respected. It created space for other advocates to build in the work, and it influenced how other European powers thought about their own colonial policies. I spent the rest of my life, died in 1566 at age 92, which was absolutely ancient for that time period, continuing to fight for indigenous rights and documenting the ongoing abuses. Never fully won the war, but definitely won some important battles that saved countless lives. The perspectives I helped establish about the humanity and the rights of indigenous people would influence people like the folks you'll hear about during the American colonial period, including people who questioned slavery and those who developed ideas about universal human rights that eventually shaped the Declaration of Independence. My story shows how individual people can challenge entire systems of oppression, even when those systems are making everyone around them rich and powerful. Sometimes being right means being extremely unpopular, and sometimes the most important work you do won't fully be appreciated until long after you're gone. Like, follow, and share the AP US History My Story podcast, because these stories hit different when you hear the original voices that shaped our country.